Hello, BookTube. Recently, Christopher Russell over on his channel, I'll leave a link to the video down below, did a currently reading video in which he held himself to a time clock. He took out his enormous cell phone, his phablet, and set a timer for himself to see if he could talk about some thoughts on what he's been reading lately in, I think he said 8 minutes, but his video went to 11. And I'm going to try and do the same thing here. I'm going to try and go through a few recent reads quickly, just to see if I can do it. So we're going to start with Richard Dannett and Robert Lyman. This is Korea, War Without End, and I thought it was very good. A very strong entry in an unfortunately not crowded field of histories of the Korean War. I thought this was really good with backdrop information, really good with larger background world setting. Not quite so strong with the actual explicit military history, but there have been books like that about Korea. We could stand some more. It's a largely forgotten conflict, as was the title of one of those books, but I liked it. But we're going to move on. Then we got to have something for the gaze. You got to have something for the gaze. This is by Saxon James, and I believe this was recommended to me from Kindle Unlimited. And it is Himbo Hitman. Which is about a hitman who's not at all good at his job, and who is constantly flubbing things and ends up being endangered not only by clients that he lets live, but by his employers. The main character is supposed to be a lovable goofball, and the book is supposed to be lovable. It's supposed to be it's told in very, very slangy, very fast-paced language. It was a little on the dumb side. Maybe it was a lot on the dumb side. The slang language, the pop culture references, the zingy humor, almost none of it lands. It feels labored, and so I read to the end because I was expecting, and I was not wrong to expect, that the main character would end up in a kind of a warm situation, that there would be a warm, heart-touching payoff to the book that had nothing to do with action. I was right about that, but I was largely unimpressed. Then we move on to I believe this is a hardcover anthology. I have the e copy, but I actually want the hardcover. If it is one, I want it, because it was even better than I remembered it. This is Superman Up in the Sky by Tom King, with most of the artwork by Andy Kubert. Is that right? Yeah, Andy Kubert. This is a story of a young girl who is abducted from Earth, and Superman takes it as his mission to find her and bring her home. A simple thing. But it turns out not to be simple at all, and it leads to an enormous number of stories in here. These were, for a while there, DC toyed with the idea of making a kind of Superman issue, mostly reprints, but also an original story that would go to supermarkets, that would look like, had the old giant size banner, and it would go to supermarkets in a deal with, I think, a certain number of retail chains, but not to comic shops. And then when that deal was over, they brought out Superman Up in the Sky as a mini-series, reprinting those issues for comic shops, and now they are all collected in one, and this is some of the best Superman stuff that I have read in years. It is just, every story in here is wonderful. Every aspect of Superman's ethical underpinning is perfectly put through the ringer here, just perfectly, with a conclusion that had me almost standing up and cheering, almost. When I learned to love this character when I was rushing home to watch The Adventures of Superman on TV in black and white and then in color. So if you work up to an emotional payoff of your Superman story that has the words "look up in the sky," I love this. Reading it as a concerted story, I loved it even more. I cannot recommend it strongly enough. But we're going to move on, because we're going to keep under time here. Then we have something by Don Gillis. I had my issues with this book. I liked its detail. This is The Battle for Boston: How Mayor Flynn Made His City Better with Progressive Values. I don't know anything about Don Gillis. I'm assuming that, as the saying goes, he is severely in the tank for Ray Flynn. I am not, and I could tell you stories about Ray Flynn that would set thy several hairs on end like quills upon a fretful porpentine. Nevertheless, he deserves some credit. He did some things. He even took some political risks, and they are all embodied in this book. This is a very good, solid piece of nonfiction reporting / history about the inner workings of Boston politics and mayoral politics, what mayors can and cannot do, what they can try and not try, and what will arrange themselves against. The main problem I have with this book, it is good, I am recommending it. The main problem I have with this is that I don't think it gave enough credit to Ray Flynn's predecessor, who was a wonderful, wonderful guy, and who actually did embody a lot of the ideals that I don't think Ray Flynn did. Ray Flynn is to a certain, Bostonians of a certain generation, he is characterized by flop sweat that is plastering his comb over to his forehead. And that was honest. That was an honest impression. Whereas his predecessor, Anyway, his predecessor has already had a great book, and this was really, really good. In terms of Boston politics, this was really, really good. And then we have something by Rachel McCarthy James. This was just plain wonderful. It shouldn't have been. It's unbelievably gruesome, but it was just plain wonderful. This is called Whack Job, and it's a history of people killing people with axes. It's just exactly what it sounds like. So when you hear that, you're immediately going to think of Lizzie Borden, the famous case of Lizzie Borden. Which became a nursery rhyme and is immortal for that fact. But there's a lot of other stuff in here, including, of course, the thing that comes first to my mind. When I hear death by axe, I don't think of Lizzie Borden. I think of the Tudors. I think of Henry VIII chopping people's heads off. I think of Mary Tudor chopping people's heads off. But it wasn't just them either. It was, for hundreds of years, it was the default means of killing people. State-wise, of the state killing people. It's a weird thing for a serial killer to want to do. I love this. I thought it was incredible. At no point does the author talk down to the reader. There's a twinkle in the eye, yes, in the narrative all throughout, despite dealing with a gruesome subject, but at no point is this dumb, easy, silly putty history. Okay, all right. This next one is not either. Again, I had my issues with it. But I do end up recommending it. This is by Christopher Clarey, and it is The Warrior. And this is his book about Rafael Nadal. Probably by the numbers, the greatest tennis player who's ever lived. If you just go by Android numbers. Now, the problem with Rafael Nadal is that he cannot anchor a book because he is largely an android. He has been practicing for 8 hours a day at tennis and then playing tennis in tournaments and games and high-profile matches for his whole life. He has never received an education of any kind. He has never developed an interest of any kind in anything else. He is simply an android that plays tennis, and has been so since he was 6. He has the masterful gestures down. He has the patter to the Bull Durham type patter to the sports reporters down pat. He's gorgeous. That always helps. That may, for all I know, be part of his Android programming. I have no idea. So the extent to which Christopher Clarey tries to make Rafael Nadal himself interesting in this book, that is hopeless. That cannot be done. But he sure does make tennis interesting. And oh my, his narration of games, particular matches, wonderful. Could have taken a whole book of that. So if you're a tennis fan, if you're a Rafael Nadal fan, a fan of his career, you're going to want to read this book, definitely. The only thing that it fell flat on me for was the human dimension, because Rafael Nadal doesn't have a human dimension. All right, well, we're talking about human dimension. We'll move on to this next book, which is nothing but, this was an absolute joy to read. This is by Jeffrey Seller, and it is long-awaited Broadway memoir, Theater Kid. And that picture, I assume, is an artful representation of him showing up in the 1990s New York of AIDS and a great era of theater, not knowing his ass from his elbow, and learning the hard way, and rising, so to speak, in the profession, until he was part of gigantic shows, until he was a producer in gigantic shows, gigantic hits. And heartbreak along the way. One of the shows that he was absolutely instrumental in bringing to a paying audience was Rent. And if you know anything about the origin of the musical Rent, you know that it is laced with tragedy because of its creator. And there are a whole bunch of heartfelt moments like that in here. This was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. I myself could not help but hear the author's voice when I was reading this thing, and I don't know if he reads the audiobook. I don't even know if there is one. If there is an audiobook and it isn't read by Jeffrey, then you should hold out until he does it himself. But I can't imagine. I mean, he's got such a big ego that he pays a double fare when he gets a taxi. So I can't imagine he would let anyone else read the audiobook. But this was wonderful. All of you theater kids out there, past or present, you have got to read this. Absolutely got to read this. Okay, then we have something that was also wonderful. I'm trying to keep an eye on the time. I'm not gonna equal Christopher's rate. I'm not going to be able to do it. This next one is wonderful, but grim. Just about as grim as it gets. This is by Mark Linus, and it's called 6 Minutes to Winter. And it is a reminder to its readers that all this talk that we get every day, that is totally justified, of climate change and global warming and the catastrophes that are headed all of our way. A huge proportion, a huge majority of the world's population lives in the Northern Hemisphere. The Northern Hemisphere is moving towards summer right now. And we know from last summer and the summer before that and the one before that it's going to be catastrophic. Absolutely catastrophic. It's holding off largely right now, but it isn't going to stay that way. We're not going to get a free summer anymore. So talk of climate change is in everybody's mouth all the time. But as the author points out, and then he demonstrates in chapter after chapter here, the world has never been closer to nuclear war. That was in the headlines just recently. Good timing for the release of his book with India and Pakistan. Suddenly saber-rattling. Both nuclear powers who ideologically hate each other down to their DNA. It's also in the news with recent developments in the whole story of negotiations with Iran. The Trump administration, if you want to call it that, the Trump regime, Trump himself, it's just him, clearly want war with Iran. And that will bring in nuclear powers. It's grim, like I said, but fascinating and well done. It's a lean, fast-paced book about the worst subject in the world. Because the author, Linus, he doesn't just talk about the geopolitical likelihood of nuclear war. He describes what it's like. He reminds you all of what it's like, of what nuclear war would be like. A full-scale nuclear exchange would not be like a giant bomb going off in a city. It would affect the whole world. It would affect the environment far more drastically and far more quickly than global warming. It would cause, well, some of you will know the phrase. You might not know what it means, but you haven't read all the books. So those of us who grew up in the Cold War under the threat of nuclear annihilation read all the books and read all the magazines. It would cause nuclear winter. That's what the winter in the title is about. It would cause nuclear winter. And human civilization would not survive. Pockets of humans might, scattered here and there. But human civilization anywhere, the aggressing nation, the victim nation, all the bystander nations, no one would live. There was a book last year, I think, or the year before that, about nuclear war, and this is this year's book. Very, very good. Then we can move on to a lighter subject. This is Peter Cooper. This is his book, Insectopolis, and it is a big, wonderful graphic novel about insects, about all kinds of insects. Oh my God, this is so visually amazing. I really want a finished print copy of this thing. Even though the print copy doesn't have pinchable artwork, I still want that. And if you are fascinated by insects, well, you've got to have this. But also, if your kids are fascinated by insects, they're going to love this. They're going to read it over and over and over again. The illustrations are so unendingly complicated, and they move from page to page so wonderfully. This is a visual feast for insect nerds. But we're going to keep going. We've just got a couple more to go, and then we've done. I've already overlasted. This next one is by Grant Garwood, and it is called Proof You Can't Ignore, the mini book of evidence for God, Jesus, and the Bible. I read stuff like this. I read Christian titles like this. Some of them please me greatly if they're done in good faith, no pun intended, if they're honest. This was a total waste of time. It trotted out dumb, threadbare points that have literally been trotted out for thousands of years and refuted for thousands of years. There is no proof for God. Mainly, I would say, because there are no gods. That's why there is no proof, because they don't exist. There's proof, maybe, for a historical figure named Jesus. Nothing more than that. That he was a miracle worker? No. There are no miracles. That he was a Messiah? No. There is no Messiah. Then there's no proof for that. No proof that even indicates that. There is proof that large numbers of people ended up believing that centuries later, but no proof that... And the Bible? Well, the Bible doesn't need proof. We know that it exists. I've got 10 copies of it on my shelf. But the truth of the Bible with a capital T, there's not only not a proof for that, there can't be any proof for that. The Bible contradicts itself a million ways. It is clearly the work not only of a fallible human, but of many fallible humans over many centuries. And this book just ignores all of that. This is just, I shudder to think that there are young people out there, young Christians out there, whose faith is so weak that they think this book is giving them quote-unquote ammunition against their faith's critics. If you are a believing Christian, young or old, if you're a believing Christian and you meet someone who hates your faith, you've met a bad person. You don't need an arsenal of equipment against them. You've met a bad person. Your faith, you know as well as I do, if you have legitimate Christian faith, it illuminates you from the inside. It warms you in your darkest hour. It makes you stronger and better. It makes you better. It gives you the strength to be a better person, to uphold the morals of Jesus Christ. It gives you the strength to do that. Now, I might privately think you have that strength anyway, but you say it's your faith that does that. And okay, if you say it's your faith that does that, great. And if you meet someone who says, well, I hate that faith, then you've met a bad person. But that faith, the thing I just described, is not a fact claim. You're claiming it as a personal claim. You're saying, without my faith, I would not have the strength to do this. I might disagree with that. There's no way to put that to the test. There's no way to know that as a fact one way or another. But that's not the same thing as saying Noah's flood happened. No, saying that Noah's flood happened or that Jesus rose from the dead, that's a fact claim. And that is wrong. You cannot prove those. There is no proof like that. So this was frustrating to read. A book just called this, Proof You Can't Ignore, could be written. It would take the form of endless numbers, thousands, tens of thousands of testimonies of Christians. Not Jesus showed up in my bathtub and told me where I lost my house keys, but my faith changed my life. Or my brother was an absolute wreck, stealing from relatives to support a drug habit. And he found religion, and it changed him. It made him a better person. Who on earth can deny the tens of thousands of stories like that and the truth of them? Who can deny that? That would be a book of proof. It wouldn't be a fact proof, but this frustrated me, obviously, very much, since I'm blasting my time limit here. And then we'll finish up. We'll finish up with a romance novel. This is by Arabella Wells, and it is The Duke's Spinster Bride. I cannot quite tell if that's an Eric cover. I try to keep up with Eric covers, but he's on so many of them that I really can't. I'm not sure that I can. I don't know. The profile's almost right, but the mouth isn't pouty enough. But this is a classic Regency romance, classic premise of a Regency romance where there's a spinster. There's a well-born young spinster. She is happy because she is free. We're encountering this in our read-along of The Claverlings by Anthony Trollope. She is free. She doesn't need to be married. She's already been married. She is a third category of person that was known even as early as the Middle Ages. Widows were third category of person. They weren't quite a man, obviously, but they also weren't quite a woman in that they no longer need the protection of a man. They no longer need a man's permission to buy a house. And she is that, and she is experiencing that freedom. But he is being pressured by his family to take a wife. And some of that pressure is getting pretty strong so that he can't really ignore it. And the two of them have an idea. Well, we will have a marriage in name only. And we'll go our separate ways after that. But, of course, since it's a romance novel, they start to like and then love each other. And I thought this was extremely well done. I think this was also suggested to me by Kindle Unlimited. But this was a hit, unlike the Himbo Hitman. So there you go. Whew. All right, under 20 minutes. It's still longer than Christopher's video, but I'll leave a link to his video because you'll want to see him beating up on poor Dan Jones. But anyway, those are some recent reads. I will wrap this up, and I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.